Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, where we talk about writing works, how writers work, and why the best writers risk being strange. One of the strangest things you can find, if you're talking about writing or just stories, is a brilliant short film called Too Many Cooks. Too Many Cooks became an internet sensation a number of years ago. And it's this brilliant little weird horror comedy. It begins seeming like the introduction to a sitcom, like the title sequence where there's a song playing, the song, Too Many Cooks, about this, ostensibly the theme for a sitcom called Too Many Cooks. Standard thing. It was like a family with a bunch of people, too many cooks in the kitchen, lots of hijinks ensue. That is sort of the idea. But then it keeps repeating. It starts repeating too long. And then as it repeats, it gets kind of stranger and stranger, and everything starts to go through these permutations. Now, I don't want to talk too much about what the film is. I think you should go watch it. Take about 10 minutes or so out of your day to go watch Too Many Cooks, and then come back to this video, this podcast, where I'm going to tell you sort of how you might read Too Many Cooks. As a writer, I'm going to quickly break down, just crash course you in the philosophy and the aesthetic theory, like the literary and film theory that kind of you need to know to understand why we have a film like Too Many Cooks out in the world. I'm going to crash course you through that, and I'm going to offer a bit of an analysis of Too Many Cooks in that context. Why I think this is useful and interesting to writers is because here's an example of a film, a story. Imagine writing a script like this. It seems like madness, but there's a real logic, there's a real structure to it. I think that writers would do very, very well to learn more about literary theory. Writers would do very well to think more about alternate or unusual, unconventional ways of structuring stories, things that don't maybe look like stories at first glance, but if you look closer, are really tight, controlled stories. I just think there's a value to this kind of analysis for writers. You got to learn when you're writing to really read and watch storytelling in different mediums, play video games, even get the storytelling in that medium. You really got to learn how the options available to you, one, how they're structured, but two, how it's possible to engage on an artistic level with them. And I think where it really begins is analysis. They say if you want to write, you really need to read. And I think the same thing is true in other mediums. You have to kind of expose yourself to a lot of different things that come at you in a lot of different ways. But of course, some of it can be very intimidating. So I'm going to kind of try to quickly, in a very fast, but also I hope not too complicated way, crash course you into a bunch of literary theory and artistic context that you sort of need to know. A bit of art history, a bit of literary theory, and a bit of an analysis of Too Many Cooks. But like I say, before we get to that, go take a look at Too Many Cooks. I'll drop in a link if I can find a good one below in the description here. But while you're out there, also go to strangeinc.ca. Go to strangeinc.ca and sign up for my newsletter, where I'll give you some more recommendations for great artworks. I'll give you some writing tips. I'll give you just sort of the news of what I'm up to creatively. I'll even show you some of my drafts. This is sort of how I like to keep in touch with you. It's an email that is sort of a bit of a little mini newsletter magazine email, but it is coming right from me. You can reply to it. It goes right to me. This is how I think we should keep in touch. And I'd really appreciate if you'd sign up at strangeinc.ca while you're out there watching Too Many Cooks. But don't forget to come back. And without further ado now, we're going to talk about Too Many Cooks.
Too Many Cooks, but I want to talk about the way that the film exemplifies an aspect of storytelling that we see in the modern age. We sometimes call this postmodern storytelling or a postmodern approach to narrative. Where that term comes from, postmodern, is if we can kind of very loosely divide modern, postmodern, and what we might call classical eras of media. So we're looking at stories, for example. We have this period before the early 20th century. So before the early 20th century, we have a wide swath of history. Throughout most of that history, we have situations where we see is that reality itself is taken for granted, and knowledge about reality is to some degree taken for granted. And what I mean by that is that we see various forms of some guarantor of truth. So in the religious world or religious cultures, we have God, some God, as the guarantor of truth. How do we know what things are real and what things are not real? Well, God will determine this. This is an ancient question in philosophy. How do we determine what is real? It's a question of ontology. Ontology means the study of reality. How do we know what is real? And then there's a second major field in philosophy called epistemology, study of knowledge. How do we know what we know, and how do we know what is real? Now, if you go back to the classical age, if you go back to Plato, to before Christ, we have these questions are still the questions as they are to this day. These are questions of philosophy. They're also questions in science, the questions in the arts. How do we determine what we know, and how do we determine what is real? Plato has a lot of thoughts about what we would use to determine these things. And throughout history, we see different philosophers and different artists, different schools of thought looking for different guarantors. What we eventually get, so I'm just going to gloss over a lot of history to get to what's salient here. What's becomes important is that in the early 20th century, we see a splintering of philosophies. We see a splintering of culture. This is a splintering that moves into the First World War. In some degree, this is the cause of the First World War, at least from a cultural, philosophical perspective. There's a shift in the early 20th century in particular, kind of coming out of the quote unquote Enlightenment, where we're trying to utilize science to determine fundamentally what is and is not true and real. We have to sort of move against the romanticism that comes out of the Enlightenment. As this reaction to the Enlightenment. Romanticism as this attempt to reclaim. You have this sort of loose trajectory in Western civilization, at least, where early on the arts and the sciences are co-mingled, and you have, for example, Lucretius writing mathematics treatises and poetry. We have this idea that if you want to know, your culture's history, if you want to know what is true and real in the world, well, you go to some artistic work. You go to the Bible if you want to know what is true. This literary, this series of texts that has been collected over the years. Some of it poetry, some of it prose, and so on and so forth. You go to the Iliad, you go to, the Odyssey, you go to these ancient poems where myths are recorded. You go to, all these, sources that are fundamentally artistic in nature or even scientific in nature. And as, of course, time goes on, the sciences become more and more the place where people go to find knowledge about the world, whereas the arts become sort of more the domain of thinking about the world. In the Enlightenment, arts really cede their point of place in the culture. We have this romantic move against that. You have all these shifts in the culture. where art becomes more or less prominent in different places, in different eras. But art is always reflecting what is happening in the culture or in the counterculture. By the early 20th century, as I say, we get a series of what we call modernist movements. And what modernist movements was in different forms, in different ways, and with different premises or different theses. We have like these series of distinct breaks from history. And, the modernist movements of the early 20th century were a series of movements attempting to do away with history, to wipe history away, to eliminate history and eliminate traditional ways of doing things and break fundamentally with tradition, break fundamentally from the ways that things had been done prior to that period. You see a number of, you see an explosion in artistic movements, surrealism, Dadaism, all these, isms, imagism, even, which we've talked about, as well. All these sorts of ways in which people, for example, in poetry, try to stop writing poetry the way it has been written before. Instead, they break fundamentally with these traditions and try to move in new directions. The idea here is an epistemological idea. The idea here is fundamentally in the modernist movements, however you want to look at it, whether it's a political movement, they're experimenting with fascism heavily and communism in this period. We see, again, these artistic movements like surrealism, which comes out of scientific movements like surrealism specifically comes really distinctly out of psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis, his developments, which, again, constitute fundamental breaks with how we thought about the mind before this point. We have, artistic groups like surrealism, again, breaking from history, trying to, have different goals, building on, these scientific breaks. We have the surrealists, of course, become very involved in communism. We have all these sorts of different ways, which, whether in art or in science or in politics, we just have people fundamentally trying to break from tradition and try new forms of governance, new forms of art, new forms of knowledge. The idea here fundamentally, as I say, this modernist idea is an epistemological idea. It's not that we, have given up on being able to access reality, but that, we don't have maybe faith in the ways that we used to do it. So prior to the modernist movements in literature, for example, which give way to things like stream of consciousness, we have instead, these naturalistic realism, psychological realism, characters in fiction. Prior to this point, fundamentally, we're getting at, how they think. Our experience of reality is mimetic in fiction. People are trying to write fiction, more or less in a way of mirroring, the real world. More or less they're trying to be realistic in how they depict characters in fiction. Then you have this massive break from that, where not only, is there the idea that either one, depending on the ism, depending on the group that's writing, maybe we have an absurdist theater where we're trying to just distinctly move away from any attempt to, get into realism, just instead break completely the illusion of the fiction, remind you at all times that you're being, that you're aware of the falsity of what you're reading. Or we have, things like stream of consciousness, where we have this attempt to actually mirror more closely in a more kind of realistic way, but not according to the conventions of realism, what it might actually, be like inside of a fictional character's head. Regardless of how you want to slice it, what we have fundamentally in these modernist movements is a belief in the stability of something that is real, a belief in the stability of, say, for example, the human experience, and just different ways of trying to get at, organizing humans or making sense of the human experience, depicting it and so on. The really, simple way to look at the break here, probably the most clear example is in Cubism, in visual art. You go from painting a chair as realistically as possible. The goal of, painting before modernism is mimesis, to mimic things in the world. You want to paint a chair so realistically, is the classical goal in art. So realistically that somebody was going to try to sit down in it. And you're going to fool people into thinking, this art is so perfectly executed that it, somehow transcends its status as art and starts to seem real or as real as, the thing that it's depicting. Modernism, they don't try to do that. Modernism, the idea becomes a perspective battle. It's this issue, again, in Cubism, I think best lays out the idea, although you see it in different ways in different art movements. Instead of looking at a chair from one point of view, we're going to look at it from 10 points of view at once. You're going to try to paint all sides of it at once, and deliver all sides of it to your perspective. That's going to somehow give you a pure, more true vision of this chair, what it's really like. And because you're not, being tied to your perspective. Modernism is all about, trying to break free from the shackles of history, trying to break free from the single perspective that has been thrust down by history. Break free from our ways of thinking about the world and try new ways of thinking about the world. Of course, what modernism ultimately culminates in is horror, is in, not one but two world wars. All these experiments, to kind of remake culture ultimately end in eugenics, in, the Nazi experiments, it goes very awry. And so what you have in the wake of the Second World War in particular, is a whole loss of faith in human institutions, a whole loss of faith in these modernist goals. These are all goals of progress, right? We have this idea that humans are moving towards some evolutionary endpoint in modernism. We're going to move towards the perfect society. Surrealism is going to liberate us from the shackles of society. This is very antisocial and very particular, nightmarish approach to history, and nightmarish perspective on history. And history is the thing we must get rid of. That's the kind of modernist idea. Once we're freed of the shackles of history, we can move towards a utopia. This doesn't hold true. Instead, we get horror, we get dystopia. We get the two world wars and other horrors. So what happens in a break from modernism, as we see a series of these postmodern crises. So fundamentally what this becomes is a crisis of faith in reality itself. It doesn't become a problem of how do we know reality. How do we know what is real? How do we know what humans are in their heart? Instead, you have this fundamental disbelief in the ability of humans to represent anything. The ability of reality to have a stability. We see in postmodernism this fundamental absence of anything outside of itself. So, by the time we get, and so the hallmarks of postmodernism are, obsession with surfaces, media surfaces. So writing that, is always calling to attention to itself as writing. The metafiction of Margaret Atwood's Happy Endings is an example of postmodern text where it's just always constantly reminding itself of its status as writing. Beware, do not read this poem by Ishmael Reed. Again, the title itself kind of turns back on itself. These are the sort of common postmodern movements where they're just constantly reminding you of their status of the media experience. They're constantly trying to, reflect from one text to another text. You have this intertextuality, it's often called, where stories just point to other stories rather than pointing to the world. We have usually in the fiction, in postmodern fictions, a total lack of character depth. Instead of trying to represent characters who approximate real people, we just give up completely on trying to have character depth. Characters are just these weird ciphers or stand-ins for other things, and we usually get just a total, brokenness to the narrative experience. So we look at Too Many Cooks. Here's an example of a film that's obsessed with mimicry of surfaces. It's using a technique that is called pastiche, where pastiche is just when you are mimicking the surface style of some other media form. In this Too Many Cooks example, on one hand, is a pastiche of sitcoms. It's just replicating the kinds of things you would see in a sitcom intro title and song. It looks this way, it sounds this way. It's replicating all the moves of that form. On the other hand, it's not parody. Parody does this sort of mimicry, but it doesn't actually, but it actually makes fun of the thing and takes a moral position. Pastiche is just a neutral mimicry. It's just representing the sitcom intro song and title set up, that whole style. But it's not really making a point necessarily about those forms. It's not taking a moral position in a particular way. In fact, it abhors moral positions. Instead, moves into the horror story. It starts to blend the pastiche of the sitcom with the pastiche of horror. It only makes sense in reference to other media. If you didn't know anything about horror slashers, and if you didn't know anything about sitcoms, this Too Many Cooks would make absolutely no sense to you. It barely makes sense even with that knowledge. There's just no outside of that thing. Everything in that film is completely bound up in itself. It doesn't really point outwards to anything except to just the surfaces of these other media forms. So there's no outside to their existence. It's completely existential. Those characters are locked inside that story. They can not even die in a certain sense. They keep, getting slaughtered and raised again and slaughtered and raised again. And there's no outside. There's no outside or escape. They're trapped inside of the very forms that they're stuck inside. You could argue that it becomes a bit of a metaphorical allegory of how society has locked us into these ways of thinking and these ways of being that don't allow us to really do anything or to have any sort of freedom. But it's a bit of a stretch to make that interpretation. In many ways, this is a film that resists interpretation, as many postmodern stories do. In many respects, they don't become about anything other than themselves. They just start to point endlessly at themselves or just reference outwards to other objects, but they don't necessarily cohere cleanly in terms of presenting a meaning. A lot of postmodern art is specifically kind of anti-meaning in one sense. They don't want to, they're sort of giving up on the idea that the author has a message to communicate and is doing so inside and through the media of the artwork. Instead, they're sort of, trying to more or less slaughter the author, present the reader's interpretation, your viewer interpretation, either as valid as some authorial message sending, or just as the only thing that you can do now in the face of this utterly mesmerizing and just sort of resistant to interpretation set of media. There's really no outside of media itself. Where it's in a media saturated culture, the media shapes our perceptions and therefore shapes our very beings. And it's not so much that there's a conspiracy of control through the media. There's a lot of conspiracy theories about how people see messages in media, but that's not really the point of a film like Too Many Cooks, and that's not even really the point, I think, of media itself. It's a much more insidious situation in the culture where we have these constant barrage of meaninglessness. It's not that we're being presented with secret subliminal messages, it's that there is no messaging. There is no nothing. There is no outside. There is nothing inherent in that constant barrage and saturation. It becomes almost impossible just to think completely, bound up inside the situation of this media barrage. You sort of lay victim and lay bare your victimhood, and nobody gets sort of outside of this system. The media has no control. There's nobody overseeing and controlling the media. The media itself is just enacting a sort of mindless, constant control. And its only service, its only demand is that you just, keep obsessively interacting with it. We have, this terrifying nightmare figure inside of Too Many Cooks, who's, as the sort of film progresses, moves it less and less, more and more out of that sitcom space, less and less, funny, and more into this nightmare, horror. It just operates to distort our reality without any, the way I like to sort of interpret or look at this particular Too Many Cooks film is it just represents the idea that nobody is outside of the system. Nobody's outside of the control of the media, but the media has no agenda. It just operates to distort reality without any goal, as if it were a living creature, as if it were victimizing us, as if that was its very nature.